Hello, this is Rohan Karanjit and Arleigh Ingram. We are, what is it?
Sheesh. We're gonna talk about, or we are.
We're going to talk about, yes, we are going to talk about. Okay. Hi, this is Rohan Karanjit and Arleigh Ingram, and we are here to talk about Abaporu by Tarsila do Amaral. And here it is. For a quick context for the painting, this painting was inspired by the anthropomyagia, a cannibalistic movement. This was a movement that was formed in Brazil, which affected the whole painting scenario in Brazil. It was mostly about Brazilian indigenous culture rising up from the colonial past. One of the core ideas about this movement was to using European culture and kind of integrating Brazilian culture into it through art. Tarsila executed this painting in her for her husband's birthday. It was in 1928, and this was almost a collaboration between writing and painting, where Oswald de Andrade, a Brazilian writer, wrote about like a manifesto of this movement, whereas she painted the painting for the meaning. This painting later was sold for $1.4 million to a Argentinian collector, Eduardo Constantini. And this was bought in an auction in 1995. And it's still known as one of the most valuable and highest gross painting from a Brazilian artist. Tarsila created this figure who is very much not in proportion to from her influence in a farm from her grandmother. Like, she heard a story about a person who eats people, and that's why she titled it Abaporu, which literally translates to a man who eats in her indigenous language, which is called Tupi. A little about the timeline of her life. She was born in 1886, September 1st, in the town of Capivari, Sao Paulo, Brazil. And she had one sibling who was older than her, Cecilia. As she studied through high school, I think it was in Sacré Cœur de Jesus, where she made her first painting, and it was about Jesus. She married Andre Teixeira Pinto, and she gave birth to her only child, Dulce, in 1906. She also studied piano, sculpture, drawing, and other various forms of art in Brazil before she went to Paris in 1920 to study higher academic art in Académie Julian, which was also very popular for having international students then. She found a lot of progress and a lot of success in Paris, and she got her first solo exhibition in 1962, and the second one was in 1928. However, she only had her first solo exhibition in Brazil a year later in 1929. Continuing her timeline, she stopped painting for a little bit, and she worked at a gallery, becoming the director of the gallery Pinacoteca Art Gallery in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And then after some time, she was supporting Brazilian Communist Party, which was illegal at that time, and she was jailed for it in 1932. One of the biggest accomplishments as an artist then was to have a retrospective exhibition. And she was one of the only peoples that had multiple retrospective exhibitions. Well, for the first one she had was in Palace Hotel in Rio de Janeiro in 1933. Unfortunately, her granddaughter, Beatrice, died trying to save her friend from a lake at the age of 15, and Tarsila was very heartbroken. She made a portrait of her granddaughter from a photograph to commemorate her. Later on, she painted a big mural in Hall of History in Abaporu Park in 1945. Even more, unfortunately, her daughter also, her only daughter, passed away in 1966. After that, she had her final exhibition in 1969 in Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro.
So to go off of what he was saying and kind of focus more on the painting itself, we're going to start off with the important formal elements of the painting. So if you look at color in this painting, you have pairs of warm and cool colors that kind of create a balance and are parallel to each other. So the person or the figure or whatever you want to call it and the sun are both kind of warm yellowish colors, and then the ground beneath the figure and the cactus are cool colors, so they're green. So those are parallel directly to each other, and they create a balance by just kind of being side by side like that. And then everything in this painting is created using curving lines and smooth texture. So the cactus is smooth, even though normally a cactus would be really spiny or spiky or sharp, it is always smooth in this painting. Scale and proportion are intentionally off. Kind of, if you look at it, you can tell that it's intentionally off because it has a giant foot and a giant hand and a teeny tiny head. And then the cactus is taller than the person and also higher up than the sun in the painting. It's really crazy. And then the sun is in the middle of the composition with the figure and the cactus on each side. They create that triangle composition that we've been talking about in class. To go off of that, if we look at the pose of the person, it kind of reminds us of the thinker. They've got the head balancing on the fist as if they're thinking and kind of looking out with thought in mind. It could have been inspired actually by the thinker. Several casts were in Paris at the time, or she could have even seen the original while she was in Europe. So this could have possibly been an influence for her. Another possible influence is Cubism, which we pretty much know is an influence for her. It's more like sure rather than possible. So she studied under at least 3 different Cubist artists, and then she visited the studio of Picasso, actually. And this painting that I've got to the left is by Picasso. You can kind of see it's planar, so everything is flat, but there's also some kind of shading that suggests volume, especially in the figure in the bottom right-hand corner, kind of has shading that suggests that it has actual shape to it. It's not just completely flat. We see that in Abaporu as well. Another possible influence, I know Rohan has already talked about her childhood on the coffee plantation and her nannies telling her the stories of the people who eat other people. So in addition to kind of like cannibalist stories from her nannies, there are things called Skeopods. They're from ancient mythology, and they are people rooted to the earth. So they have this one gigantic foot that they use to cover themselves from sun and rain. And they were also monstrous cannibals, since cannibalism is kind of our main theme as we go through this. To go off of that even more, Abaporu can be translated into the one who eats, man who eats, or a person who eats human flesh. And that is from the Tupi-Guarani Indian language that's native to her area in Brazil. As Rohan said, it was a gift for her husband, who was a writer, and he created the Cannibal Manifesto based off of it. In a little more detail, the Cannibal Manifesto called for Brazilians to revolt against European elements that were of the past and take their new culture and steal it for their own, so they could create a new Brazilian identity through cultural absorption. So kind of taking things away from Europeans and making it their own, versus how they had been colonized and their kind of culture had been taken and made, you know, into something new for the Europeans. So kind of going back against them in the same way. And also, some people say, I've read several different interpretations of this painting, that the figure looks longingly at maybe the cactus or maybe out at us, as if it would like to eat us, or it's something that it can't have that it would like to have. So that's kind of another way that it kind of feels cannibalistic almost. You can see to the left that we've got the original Cannibal Manifesto, that as it was printed, and a line drawing of the painting was actually included in this, which kind of furthers the fact that it was influence for this movement. Moving on from creating this movement, Abaporu, as Rohan stated, sold for 1.4 million. So it was the most valuable painting by a Brazilian artist. That was the most that any painting coming from Brazil had sold for. And then retrospectives are really important. It's looking back at all of the work that this artist has created and kind of their journey through life. And the most recent retrospective that Amaral had was at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, here in the US. It was in 2018. And it was really important. They called it even Inventing Modern Art in Brazil, because that is exactly what she did. She started the modern art movement there, and it led to the work of many others. So important points to keep in mind. She focused on things that reflected Brazil and its people while staying true to what she learned from modern artists in Paris. So for example, the title of the painting is in a native language. There's a cactus that's, you know, from her place of birth. She's got the figure that she heard about from stories on the plantations, but it's still in the really flat yet volumetric kind of Picasso-esque cubist kind of state. So everything that she learned was translated through her Brazilian heritage. And then again, this painting was the start for the cannibalist movement. So they were seeking to cannibalize ideas from European culture and create a new Brazilian identity after colonialism. That was the whole point. And she intentionally skewed texture, proportion, and size when making the painting. You can tell it just by looking at it. It is really wild to see something that has a giant foot and a teeny tiny head, but it was intentional. And it is the most valuable painting made by a Brazilian artist after selling at auction for $1.4 million. So this painting and her legacy are really important, especially for Brazil, but also for modern art. Sadly, she died in 1973, leaving behind this legacy as the first and most influential modern Brazilian artist. So it is great that we get to give this presentation and remember her. Sweet. Now we're done.